Part 2 of our revolutionary art exhibit. Look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 prints, and we'll do them in chronological order. First up, this print is called The Death of Marat. It was done in 1793 by Jacques-Louis David, who is kind of the artist laureate of the French Revolution. This shows Marat being murdered, and the murderess was actually caught and guillotined, and different factions in the French Revolution tried to blame each other for the crime. It's the only one of David's propaganda paintings actually to survive. He hid it when he was exiled for his part in the Reign of Terror. The original painting is currently displayed at the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, so we could not afford to show you the original, and that's why we have this print. This 1794 painting by the same artist is called The Tennis Court Oath. This Tennis Court Oath was very important because David thought it was the artist's moral duty to paint elevated subjects rooted in ancient ideas of virtue. And this was when 576 out of the 577 members of France's National Assembly vowed, in defiance of the royal authority, not to leave until they had drafted a constitution for France. On the morning of June 20th, the deputies were shocked to discover the doors to their chamber were locked and guarded by soldiers. Immediately fearing the worst and anxious that a royal coup was imminent, they congregated in a nearby indoor tennis court where they took a solemn collective oath, quote, never to separate and to meet wherever circumstances demand until the constitution of the kingdom is established and affirmed on solid foundations. The deputies pledged to continue to meet until a constitution had been written, despite the royal prohibition. This is again another work by Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of Horatio. It was actually commissioned by the king to be painted as an allegory about loyalty to the state, but of course David went off script and painted this scene, an earlier part of the story, instead. The painting occupies an extremely important place in the body of work that David has in the history of French painting. It was a proclamation of the new neoclassical style, which emphasized the dramatic lighting, the ideal forms, and the gestural clarity, presenting a lofty patriotic theme. The work became the principal model for noble and heroic historical paintings of the next 2 decades. It was an instant hit with the critics and public alike. A little background on the story: it's a scene from a Roman legend about a dispute between 2 warring cities. Instead of the 2 cities, one was Rome, one was Alba Longa, sending their armies to war, they agreed to choose 3 men from each city, and the victor in that fight would be victorious for the city. The 3 Roman brothers were the Horatii, and they're seen here saluting their father and willing to sacrifice their lives for their country. Though 2 of the Roman brothers die, the third is able to kill all 3 of the other side, the Curati brothers, and the tragedy is even greater than that because the 5 people died, but the women shown crying one had a blood relationship with a person on the other side, one had a marital or romantic relationship with the people on the other side. So the message was kind of loyalty to country above loyalty to family. And in this painting, the 3 brothers expressed their loyalty and solidarity with Rome before battle, wholly supported by their father. So these men were willing to lay down their lives out of patriotic duty, and it was a call for Frenchmen to do the same for their country. This is actually one of our favorites. It's called Women's March on Versailles. Hell hath no fury like that of French housewives upset over the high cost and scarcity of bread. The Women's March on Versailles was one of the earliest and most significant events of the French Revolution. They demonstrated, and it quickly got kind of mixed up with the activities of the revolutionaries, who wanted political reforms in a constitutional monarchy. The crowd besieged the palace and pressed their demands upon King Louis. The next day, the crowd forced the king, his family, and most of the French assembly to return to Paris with them. So this march symbolized a new balance of power that placed the ancient privileged orders of the French nobility and favored the nation's average Joes instead, Joes and Josephines, instead of the royalty. This is a pretty famous painting. This one is by Jean-Pierre Howell. That last artist, the last one about the March on Versailles, Women's March on Versailles, the artist is unknown. That was a 1789 painting. This is also a 1789 painting where Parisians really hated the Bastille. They saw it as housing prisoners that were sent there directly by the king without trial. And it was surrounded by a lot of myths of dying prisoners, innocent people chained to walls, torture chambers, smelly dungeons, and so on. So this watercolor by Jean-Pierre Howell depicts the fall of the Bastille in Paris on that morning of the 14th of July, 1789. It was mostly symbolic since it only had, I think, 7 prisoners at the time. The fall of the Bastille was used thereafter as a symbol of the potency of the French Revolutionary movement, which kind of spread like wildfire after that event. Next up, this is Napoleon crossing the Alps. This one is kind of like if you saw part 1, similar to the picture of Washington crossing the Delaware. It's a very nice painting, but it's really not very historically accurate. Some people say it is more propaganda than art. So it was actually commissioned by Charles IV, who was then King of Spain, to be hung in the gallery of paintings of other great military leaders housed in the Royal Palace in Madrid. It commemorates Napoleon leading his troops across the Alps in a military campaign against the Austrians, which ended in their defeat in June at the Battle of Marengo. Napoleon wouldn't actually sit for this portrait, so David had his sons take turns dressing like him and sitting on top of a ladder. That might account for why Napoleon looks so young in this picture, because he wasn't really that young at the time that it happened. So in real life, the trouble is Napoleon actually followed his men 3 days later across the Alps, and he didn't go on a white horse like this. He went on a mule, which really is much more practical if you're going to cross the Alps. And finally, we have Lady Liberty leading the people, an 1830 painting. So this was done after the Revolution. Most of those others were contemporary that you saw before this. Lady Liberty leading the people. Delacroix, the artist Eugene Delacroix, is quoted as saying, "If I haven't fought for my country, at least I'll paint for her." So by the time he painted Liberty leading the people, he had already abandoned the precise drawing that characterized the academic art of his time in favor of this more romantic way, freely brushed color. The fighters are from a mixture of social classes, and what they have in common is the fierceness and determination in their eyes, if you can take a look at that. The French government bought this painting in 1831, but returned it to Delacroix the next year. You may have thought that the political message was too inflammatory. So that is our exhibit on the French Revolution, and we hope it was enjoyable and informative.